The voice. In the fog. The first time I heard the voice, I answered it. If I had answered it a second time, I probably wouldn't be here now. I'm 44 years old. I've spent close to 20 years hiking and backpacking solo in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of person other people call cautious to the point of being boring about it. I check weather 3 times before a trip. I tell people exactly where I'm going and when to expect me back. I don't do the things that get people featured in the kind of stories you're about to hear. I did everything right on the trip I'm going to tell you about. That's exactly why I still don't have an explanation for what happened. I want to walk you through this in order, because the order is the only thing that makes the second half of this story make sense. If I told you the ending first, you'd assume I was exaggerating the beginning to make it scarier than it actually was. I wasn't. The beginning was genuinely ordinary, right up until it wasn't. There's a detail near the very end of this account that I've never told anyone outside the people closest to me. I'm going to get to it. But you need everything that came before it first. The trip. This happened 3 years ago, in early October, on a solo backpacking trip into a remote section of the Olympic Peninsula that I'd hiked twice before, though never alone, and never this deep into the interior. I'd taken dozens of solo trips like this one over the years, and this felt exactly as unremarkable as any of them had. I want you to hold on to how ordinary that first day felt, because it's the last time in this story that anything felt that way. The fog. On the morning of the second day, I woke to fog thicker than anything I'd ever hiked through in that region before. Visibility had dropped to maybe 15, 20 feet at most, the kind of fog where you lose sight of your own trekking poles if you let your arm drop too far from your body. I checked my map, confirmed my bearing as best I could, and made the decision to continue on, slowly and carefully, rather than lose an entire day sitting in camp. I broke camp and started up the trail, the fog pressing in close enough that the trees on either side of the path existed only as vague gray suggestions of themselves. That's when I heard it, for the first time. The first voice. I want to describe this as precisely as I can, because precision is the only thing standing between this account and the kind of story that gets dismissed before it's finished being told. A voice, somewhere off to my left, beyond the limit of what I could see in that fog. A man's voice, calling out something I couldn't fully make out, the words swallowed by distance, and the strange muffling quality fog has on sound. I stopped walking immediately. I called back, the way you do when you assume reasonably that another hiker is somewhere nearby and might appreciate knowing they're not alone out there either. Nothing answered for a long moment. Then the voice came again, slightly different in tone, like someone calling out to confirm they'd actually been heard. I answered a second time, told them where I was on the trail, the way hikers do when visibility is bad and a friendly check-in costs nothing and might genuinely help someone. I want you to remember that I did that. It matters later. The voice didn't answer again. I stood there for a minute or two, fog curling past me in slow gray ribbons, before I told myself the other hiker had probably moved on, continuing whatever direction they were headed, and resumed my own hike. At the time, I thought that was simply a strange but unremarkable moment. One more small story to mention at the trailhead later. I was wrong. The second voice. Closer, about 20 minutes later, I heard it again. closer this time. Close enough that I instinctively turned to look in its direction, even though the fog gave me nothing to actually see. I called out again, the way you naturally do, and this time I want to be honest that something about the silence that followed felt different than it had the first time. Longer, heavier somehow, though I recognize how strange that probably sounds. The voice came back, closer still, the words almost clear enough to make out, before fading again into that same muffled, fog-distorted quality that made distance and direction nearly impossible to judge with any confidence. I stood on that trail for a solid minute, doing the kind of mental math experienced hikers do without fully realizing it. 20 minutes of walking, and whoever this was had closed distance on me, despite the fact that I hadn't seen another single footprint, heard another single footstep, or found any other sign that a second person was actually out there on that same stretch of trail. I scanned the ground around me in that brief moment, the same way you check for any confirming evidence when something doesn't add up. Soft dirt on either side of the trail, damp enough from the fog itself to hold a print easily. Nothing. Just my own boot marks, the ones I'd already made walking that exact stretch. I told myself the fog was simply distorting my sense of distance. I held on to that explanation for almost the rest of that morning. The voice changed direction. I want to tell you about the moment that explanation started to genuinely fall apart, because it's the detail that shifted everything for me. About an hour after that second call, deep enough into the fog that I'd lost all but the most basic sense of my own position relative to the trail itself, I heard the voice again, this time from my right, not my left, where it had originally come from. My right. A complete reversal, as though whoever was calling had somehow circled around me entirely, or had never been in the direction I originally assumed at all. I stopped again, fully still this time, listening hard, trying to use what little directional hearing the fog allowed me to actually pin down where this was coming from. It called again. From my right, then, within the same exchange, from somewhere closer to directly ahead of me on the trail. I turned in a slow, careful circle, scanning the gray wall of fog in every direction, half expecting, half hoping to see some shape resolve out of it that would simply explain everything. Nothing did. Just the same uniform, featureless gray, in every direction I turned. I want to be honest about what that did to me. Standing alone on that path with visibility reduced to a tight gray circle around my own body. A single person walking, even quickly, even circling deliberately, doesn't produce that kind of rapid, inconsistent directional shift without me hearing footsteps, without me seeing some trace of movement at the edge of that fog. I called out one more time, asking directly whether anyone needed help, whether anyone was lost. The voice answered, and this time it used my name. The voice knew my name. I want to walk you through this moment as carefully and as honestly as I possibly can, because it's the single detail that changed the entire character of this story for me, instantly and completely. I had not told anyone on that trail my name. I had not introduced myself during either of the previous exchanges. I'd called out generic, ordinary things. Hello, is someone there? Do you need help? The kind of phrases any hiker calls out to another hiker in poor visibility, without ever once offering any personal identifying information at all. I checked my pack as I stood there, an absurd, reflexive instinct, as though I might somehow find my name written somewhere on the outside of it that I'd simply forgotten about. There was nothing. There never had been. The voice said my name clearly, through the fog, from a direction I genuinely could not pin down with any confidence. I stood absolutely still on that trail for what felt like a very long time. I want to be honest that my first instinct wasn't fear. Not yet. It was confusion. The specific, disorienting kind of confusion that comes from your own senses, delivering information your mind has no existing framework to process. I remember actually laughing once, a short, startled sound that had nothing to do with anything being funny. I called back, asking who was there, asking how they knew my name. The voice said my name again. Nothing else. Just my name, spoken in that same calm, unhurried tone it had used for everything else. That's when the fear actually arrived. Why the calm tone was worse. I want to address something directly here, because I think it's the detail most people who haven't experienced something like this fail to fully understand. The voice never once sounded aggressive. It never sounded urgent, panicked, or threatening in any way I could clearly identify. If anything, it sounded patient, calm, the way you'd speak to someone you were simply waiting for, rather than someone you intended to harm. I want to explain why that calm quality unsettled me more than aggression would have. A panicked voice, an aggressive voice, gives you a framework you already understand. You know how to respond to threat, even if the response is simply running. A calm voice, repeating your name from a location that defies normal physical explanation, gives you nothing to work with at all. There's no threat behavior to react to, and yet every instinct built over 20 years of trusting my own senses was telling me that something about this situation was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I've thought about that mismatch more than almost anything else since. Fear, the kind your body actually understands, comes paired with a target, a sound to run from, a shape to avoid. This had no shape, no urgency, nothing for my own nervous system to organize itself around. Just a calm voice, patiently repeating my name in conditions that made it physically impossible to locate. I stood on that trail, fog pressing close on every side, and made a decision I've turned over in my mind more times than almost any other decision in my life. I decided to find out who was actually out there. The voice sounded familiar. I want to tell you about something that happened in the minutes that followed, because it's a detail I genuinely don't know what to do with, even 3 years later. The voice called again, and this time, listening more carefully than I had in the panic of the previous exchange, I noticed something that unsettled me almost as much as my own name had. It sounded familiar. Not identical to anyone specific I could immediately place, but close enough to someone. I genuinely couldn't tell you who even now, no matter how many times I've tried to reconstruct that memory afterward. That some old, animal part of my brain responded to it, the way you respond to a familiar voice rather than a stranger's. I tried, standing there, to run through every voice I actually knew well enough to compare it against. My father, who's been gone 11 years now. An old friend from college I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. My own brother. None of them matched cleanly. All of them, in some small, maddening way, seemed to brush up against it. I want to be honest about how dangerous that familiarity actually was, looking back. A stranger's voice, however strange the circumstances, keeps a healthy distance in your mind. A voice that sounds even slightly familiar bypasses that distance almost completely. I found myself, despite every reasonable doubt I had, walking toward it. Not consciously deciding to follow it, not in the way that sounds when I say it now. Simply finding that my feet had started moving in its direction, the way you move toward anything that pulls at some old, half-buried instinct you don't have full conscious control over. I had started following it. I want to describe exactly what that felt like, because it's the part of this story I have the hardest time explaining to people who weren't there. I wasn't thinking clearly. I want to be honest about that. 20 years of hiking experience, all the careful, measured judgment I prided myself on, and in that moment, all of it had narrowed down to a single, overriding compulsion to find the source of a voice that knew my name and sounded like someone I couldn't quite place. The voice called again, ahead of me now, consistently ahead, no longer shifting wildly in direction the way it had before. A clear, steady line, leading me forward through fog so thick I could barely see my own boots. I left the trail itself at some point during this, though I genuinely cannot tell you exactly when. There was no dramatic moment of stepping off a clear path into untracked forest. The trail simply dissolved into the same gray uncertainty as everything else, and I never noticed the transition happening. I followed it for what I estimate, reconstructing the timeline afterward, was close to 40 minutes. I want you to understand that 40 minutes, off-trail, in zero visibility, following a voice with no clear physical source, is exactly the kind of decision that gets experienced hikers killed in conditions like that. I had no way of knowing in that moment exactly how close to true that was about to become, a question only one person could answer. I want to tell you about something I tried partway through that 40 minutes, because it's a detail that has bothered me as much as almost anything else from that morning. Some small, still functioning part of my mind, even through the compulsive fog of following that voice, recognized that I needed some way to actually test what I was dealing with. I called out a question, specific enough that only one person in my life could have reasonably known the answer. A small detail from a shared memory I'd never discussed with anyone else, and certainly never written down anywhere a stranger could have found it. The voice didn't answer the question directly. It simply called my name again, in that same calm, patient tone, as though the question itself hadn't registered at all, or hadn't mattered. I want to be honest about what that non-answer did to me, more than almost anything else that morning. A person attempting deception, confronted with a specific test like that, typically does something. Bluffs, deflects, asks a clarifying question of their own. This did none of those things. It simply continued exactly as it had before, repeating my name, as though the entire exchange had been a formality it had no real interest in engaging with. I called the question again, louder, more insistent. The voice called my name a third time, from a position slightly ahead of where it had been a moment before. I kept walking anyway. I want to be honest about that too. The terrain ahead. I want to tell you about the moment everything changed, because it's the detail that, 3 years later, still makes my hands unsteady when I think about it clearly. The fog thinned, just slightly, just long enough for me to make out the ground a few feet ahead of where I was walking. There was no ground. I stopped so abruptly I nearly lost my footing on the loose scree beneath me, my own momentum nearly carrying me forward, past the point where I'd actually stopped. I remember the specific, physical sensation of that moment more clearly than almost anything else from that entire trip. The way my body understood the danger half a second before my mind fully caught up to what I was actually looking at. I dropped to my knees right there, the adrenaline hitting all at once, and stayed like that for several seconds just breathing, the cold, wet ground soaking through my pants without my noticing until much later. A few more steps, walking at the pace I'd been walking, following that voice with the same blind, compulsive focus I'd had for the better part of 40 minutes. And I would have gone straight over the edge of a drop I still don't have an exact measurement for, because I never went close enough afterward to measure it precisely, based on what I could see in the brief clearing of fog, and based on what a ranger later told me about that exact section of terrain. It was easily enough to kill a person on impact, or close enough that the distinction wouldn't have mattered. I stood frozen at that edge for several seconds, my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my own ears, looking down into gray nothing where solid ground should have continued. The voice called again, from somewhere beyond that edge. I did not move toward it. What I understood in that moment, I had been led there. Something had called my name, in a voice that sounded familiar enough to override 20 years of careful judgment, and had used that familiarity to walk me, step by step, through zero visibility fog, directly toward a cliff edge I never would have approached under any other circumstances. My legs actually shook, the way they do after a near miss on a highway. That strange physical aftermath that arrives only once the danger is already past. The voice called once more. I didn't answer. I turned around and started walking back the way I'd come. Getting back to the trail. I had no clear memory of the exact path I'd taken following that voice. I relied entirely on my compass, moving slowly, checking constantly, certain I'd hear that voice again. It never called again. Not once, for the entire hour and a half it took me to find my way back to the actual trail. A voice that calls repeatedly for over an hour, then falls completely silent the moment I refuse to follow it any further, suggests something about intent that I still haven't found a comfortable way to think about. I found the trail eventually, and felt a wave of relief so intense I had to sit down for several minutes before I trusted my legs to keep walking. The rest of that day, the fog lifted gradually over the following few hours, the gray claustrophobia of that morning replaced by ordinary forest, ordinary light. I made the decision to cut the trip short. I no longer trusted that drainage the way I had 24 hours earlier. I hiked back out a full day ahead of schedule, checking behind me far more carefully than I'd ever checked anything on any previous solo trip. Nothing called out again. The ranger station, I described the entire experience as carefully and as factually as I could manage once I was back in cell range. The ranger listened carefully, asking detailed, specific questions about the exact section of trail and the timing of the fog, without offering any confident explanation either way. I remember him pausing at one point. Pen stopped over the form he was filling out, before asking me to repeat the part about my name a second time, more slowly. He told me something near the end of that conversation that has stayed with me. That stretch of trail had a quiet, informal reputation among rangers who worked that district, the kind of reputation that doesn't make it into any official literature. Other hikers over the years had described something similar. Voices in fog, calls that seemed to know things about the hiker that a stranger shouldn't reasonably know. He told me he'd personally always wondered about a couple of those cases, given how experienced some of the hikers involved had actually been. But he'd also never met anyone who'd actually followed one all the way to wherever it was leading, the way I had. I didn't push him for more. I've regretted that more than once since. The follow-up call. I want to tell you about something that happened almost a month later, because it's a piece of this account that exists entirely independently of my own memory or my own research. The same ranger called me, unprompted, on a number I'd left with him in case anything came up. A colleague who covered search and rescue operations in that same district had gone back through old incident files out of simple professional curiosity and found 2 prior reports, both at least a decade old, both involving experienced solo hikers in that same stretch of wilderness, both describing fog and a voice. Neither hiker had been seriously hurt. Neither report mentioned the hiker's name being used. I asked him directly about that because it had been the single most unsettling part of my own experience. He told me he didn't know, that the older report simply hadn't asked that specific question, the way nobody thinks to ask a question until someone else's account makes them realize it might matter. I sat with that phone call for a long time after I hung up, telling my sister, I want to tell you about the conversation I had with my sister roughly a week after I got home, because it's the first time I told this story to anyone outside an official capacity, and her reaction has stayed with me as much as the experience itself. I'd called her the evening I got back, the way I always do after a solo trip, mostly to confirm I'd made it out safely, and to close the loop on the check-in arrangement we'd set up before I left. I hadn't told her any of this yet. I wasn't sure, in that first phone call, that I was ready to. I told her the full story almost 2 weeks later, sitting across from her at her own kitchen table, the same kind of ordinary domestic setting where I'd later hear that voice myself, though I didn't know that yet at the time. She listened without interrupting, the way she's always been good at doing, and when I finished, she sat quietly for a moment before asking me a single question. She asked whether the voice had sounded like our father. I want to be honest about what that question did to me, because I hadn't said anything about who the voice had reminded me of, only that it had sounded familiar in a way I couldn't fully place. She told me gently that she'd asked because something about the way I described the calm, patient, unhurried quality of it had reminded her immediately and specifically of the way our father used to call us in for dinner from the back porch when we were kids. A particular cadence neither of us had heard out loud in the 11 years since he'd passed. I never confirmed that it was him. I want to be honest that I don't believe it was, not in any literal sense I can defend. But I also haven't been able to fully shake the specific, unsettling resonance of that question, asked by the one person who knew exactly what that cadence used to sound like, without my ever describing it to her directly. What I did with that information, I went home and spent 2 weeks researching everything I could find about that specific drainage, looking for any documented account that matched what had happened to me. I found little in any official record. What I did find, scattered across a handful of hiking forums and old trip reports, were a few accounts, vague and second-hand in most cases, describing something similar enough that I couldn't dismiss it as my own isolated imagination. None of those accounts described anyone being harmed directly by the voice itself. Several described near misses remarkably similar to my own, a voice that seemed to call from shifting, inconsistent directions. In at least 2 cases, a voice that reportedly knew the hiker's name. One account stayed with me longest. A woman, 6 years before mine, in a drainage 40 miles away on the opposite side of that same wilderness area, had described almost exactly the same experience. Fog. A voice, her own name, spoken clearly, in a tone she called eerily gentle. She never mentioned a cliff edge. She simply described turning back at some point, out of what she called a feeling rather than any concrete reason, and never being able to fully explain afterward why she'd made that decision. I tried to message her through that same forum account, hoping she might still check it occasionally. I never got a response. Her account, when I checked back a year later, had been deleted entirely, with no trace of her original post remaining anywhere I could find it. Why I don't believe it was a person. It's possible another person was out there that morning, someone who somehow knew my name and led me toward that cliff edge with genuine malicious intent. I never saw a single footprint besides my own, in conditions where fog had left the ground damp enough to hold a clear print easily. I never heard a single footstep, despite a voice that moved with enough speed and directional inconsistency that any person producing it would have had to be moving quickly and carelessly across difficult terrain. And I have never been able to identify, in 3 years of trying, any person in my life whose voice that familiar quality could have actually belonged to. A person can be cunning. A person can be quiet. I don't believe a person can be quite that silent, across that much uneven terrain, for that long, without leaving a single piece of physical evidence behind. Why I don't believe it was simple disorientation. Fog absolutely distorts sound. I want to take seriously the possibility that exhaustion and the physics of sound, traveling through dense moisture, combined to produce an experience that felt more deliberate than it actually was. What that explanation struggles to account for is my own name. Disoriented hearing produces vague, half-formed sound. It does not typically produce a specific, clearly articulated proper noun, spoken not once but twice, in a voice carrying enough consistency that I recognized a familiarity in it. I asked a doctor about this directly, months later, framing it as a general curiosity. She told me auditory pattern matching under stress is real and documented. She also told me that the specificity I was describing sat at the very outer edge of what she'd expect that phenomenon to produce on its own. The question I still can't answer, if something out there genuinely wanted to lead me toward that cliff edge, why use a calm, familiar voice rather than anything more aggressive or coercive? Why call repeatedly, patiently, for the better part of an hour, rather than simply letting the fog and the terrain do whatever damage they were going to do on their own? I don't have a satisfying answer. Predatory deception, in any context I understand, from 20 years outdoors, typically escalates as a target approaches a point of vulnerability. This never escalated at all. The voice remained exactly as calm in its final call, from somewhere beyond that cliff edge, as it had been in its very first call, over an hour earlier. I don't know what kind of intent produces that specific, unwavering consistency. Why I'm telling you this now. It's possible another person was responsible. It's possible fog and exhaustion combined to produce an experience that felt more deliberate than it actually was. I take those possibilities seriously, because this story loses something the moment it sounds more certain than I actually am. But I also know that I heard a voice call my name, clearly, twice, in conditions where no other person should reasonably have known where I was. I know that voice led me toward terrain that would very likely have killed me had the fog not thinned at exactly the moment it did. I know a ranger told me my account wasn't unique. I know a separate search turned up 2 more accounts from that same stretch of wilderness. And I know my own sister, hearing nothing more than my description of its tone, asked me a question about our father that I'd given her no reason to ask. None of those facts, on their own, prove anything. Together, they're the reason this has never fully closed for me. The detail I've never told anyone about 6 months after that trip, alone in my own house on an ordinary evening, doing nothing more unusual than washing dishes with the television on low in the next room, I heard, for just a moment, something that sounded exactly like that voice, calling my name from somewhere just outside my own kitchen window. I went to the window immediately, my hand still wet from the dishes. There was nothing there. No one in my yard. No sign of anyone having been there at all, in conditions where my own back porch light would have made any actual person immediately visible. I haven't heard it again since, in 3 years. I still don't know who was speaking. I still don't know why it wanted me to follow. And some nights, doing something as ordinary as washing dishes in my own kitchen, I still find myself listening for it.